All right, folks, it is Monday. It's Dr. King's Day. And happy Dr. King's Day to everybody. And let's celebrate a little bit of who he was and who he stood for and what he stood for on this crossover episode of Locked on Diamondbacks and Locked on MLB.
You are Locked on MLB, your daily MLB podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to a Locked on MLB, Locked on Diamondbacks crossover on today, the 16th day of January, 2023. This is the podcast we talk about all of Major League Baseball. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. If you don't believe me, look at my lower third. Why would that lie to you? You can call me Sully. I am an Emmy-nominated television producer who has been a baseball podcaster for over a decade now. And some of you may recognize me from some of my HBO Sports appearances and other things like that. And this is now my fifth year is that true? Holy cats. at the Locked On Podcast Network. Wow. This is my fifth season. The Nationals won, the Dodgers won, the Braves won. Yeah, this is the beginning of my fifth year. Wow. Anyway, once a week, I do a crossover with this guy over here who is in Arizona. Tell people your name. I forgot it.
Yeah, it's Millard Thomas, in case y'all forgot out there. Yeah, I don't know if you guys remember me from anything like HBO, like Sully Baseball, like that. I used to do weather for Arizona PBS through Cronkite News for like a semester. So maybe you guys know me from being the weatherman out here in Arizona. If you guys watch local news. But hey, you can follow me on Twitter at the same time, at Creator Thomas24 for my personal account. Look up the show account, Locked on Diamondbacks, both Twitter, Instagram for the podcast handle. And please hit subscribe on the Locked on Diamondbacks YouTube channel.
And yeah, absolutely. And you haven't been nominated for an Emmy yet. You haven't appeared on HBO yet. But you're also you're 9. How old are you?
You're 25, so definitely
25.
not.
Okay, I am literally twice your age.
Okay, but we're still going through a quarter life. I'm still going through a quarter life crisis over here.
So. I know, but like when people say literally, that's most of the time they use it incorrectly. I am literally twice your age. You're 25. I'm 50.
But you're also twice as good looking, Sully. So
that's true. That's true. And may you still have your hair at age 50.
I'm praying. I love my hair.
I know. I like your hair too, man. By the way, a couple of things we would want to mark about today, which is the 16th, which was Dr. King Day, of course. Today is Albert Pujols' birthday. Happy birthday, Albert Pujols. Now retired, absolute first ballot Hall of Famer. One of the great, are there suspicions and clouds about him? Yeah, probably, as with every single slugger for his era. And he stood heads and shoulders above most of the players of his era and did so with a sense of flair and dramatic. He should be in the if there's a Hall of Fame of Hall of Fames, Albert Pujols belongs in the Hall of Fame. One of the great figures of the 2000s. And when they put together his plaque to put up there in 5 years or, whenever he's elected, there will be two things that everyone will say. He deserves it. What a great Cardinal legend. And, oh, I totally forgot he played for the Dodgers for a little bit. Because when the Angels finally ate his contract, he finished the 2021 season with the Los Angeles Dodgers. And he'll be yet another Hall of Famer who people will look at their plaque and go, when did they play for the Dodgers? I'm looking at you, Juan Marichal, Frank Robinson, Ricky Henderson, Jim Thome, Greg Maddux, eventually Max Scherzer, and Albert Pujols will have when the hell were they on the Dodgers?
Can even throw like a Manny Machado on that list too. I think.
Manny Machado. If he makes it to the Hall, there'll be a lot of wait, he was the Dodgers. That's right. He was with the Dodgers for about a second and a half. Dodgers have a bunch of those people just passing through. We're just passing through. But happy birthday to Pujols. And this is actually, it's Dr. King Day, and there's a lot of people will be posting lots of quotes and lots of things that he said, things we can learn from the time. And I just want to bring up another person who fought for the rights of players and also had to fight for a lot of a lot of the strife at his time, fought through a lot of racial strife, and was very brave in standing up for what he believed in, even though the consequences didn't turn out well. That's a sign of real bravery, in my opinion. This is the anniversary of Curt Flood not uh, not joining the Philadelphia Phillies. It happened 53 years ago. For those of you who don't know who Curt Flood was, Millard, you know who Curt Flood is?
I'm not too familiar, Sully, to be
That's
honest.
fine. That's fine. Sometimes you gotta baseball. The history of baseball is never dead. Baseball
Mhm.
exists in the past, present, and future at all times. We're always addressing the past. We're always addressing the ghosts, whether it's the ghosts of Babe Ruth hanging over the Red Sox, the all the titles that the Yankees won over time, the ghosts of whatever team is trying to win their first title since this or chase the record by that. We're always referring to the past in baseball, but we're relating it to the present and looking forward to the future. That's why they all wear number 42 on Jackie Robinson Day. You're honoring the past and moving forward, trying to make a better future. That's part of the appeal of the game. You're joining it, as Keith Olbermann said in uh, the Ken Burns special. It's like you're joining a river in midstream. I'm not trying to bring up anyone political. It was actually a very nice way of putting it. Curt Flood, who wrote this book called "The Way It Is" about his about this struggle, was an African American player of the St. Louis Cardinals, briefly with the Reds, but mainly with the Cardinals. When they went to the World Series left and right in the 60s, he was considered the second best defensive center fielder in baseball, the best being Willie Mays. He was a very good hitter, an outstanding fielder, and was a spark plug of those Cardinals teams. He also was on a team filled with strong personalities and fighters like Bob Gibson, like Orlando Cepeda, like Lou Brock, and he didn't stand out amongst them. The Cardinals had a reputation after some pushback of being one of the more progressive teams in baseball. They actually did the unthinkable, like making sure all the players can stay at the same hotel, no matter what this color their skin was. That was revolutionary in the 60s, making sure everyone could eat at the same restaurant. Again, revolutionary in the 60s. We take this for granted now, or maybe some people take for granted now. Flood loved playing for the Cardinals. He also was a very good artist. He had an art studio, was a painter, but that's neither here nor there. Um, he was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies for Dick Allen and several other players. And the Phillies had the reputation of being one of the worst teams to play for if you're an African American. And he said, I've been playing in baseball for 11 years. No, I'm not going to go. At the time, there was no free agency. None. You couldn't just say, there was, this is another thing you have to wrap your head around. At the time, there was the reserve clause. And at the end of each year, if you couldn't agree to a contract, the team would just renew your contract and you couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't negotiate with the other team. You could only go to another team if you were traded. And Curt Flood said, no, actually, I'm not going to the Phillies. I have the right to go to any other person. If they didn't like their job, they would find another employer. And he announced he was a free agent and refused to report to the Phillies. And what came about was a gigantic court fight that went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And Curt Flood, how do I say this? When he brought up the fact that it was the amendment that banned slavery that made it illegal for him to be bound to a team against his wishes, let's just say the press didn't treat him very well. Let's just say he was vilified. Let's just say the word uppity was brought about him. And another word was put after that I'm not going to say. And the fact that he fought for his right to play for where he wanted to play made him look like they was this greedy, awful person who's going to destroy the game of baseball. And his court case didn't win. He did not win. Ultimately, he was released, played a handful of games with the Senators. But then when he came into the locker room, he saw someone had broken in and put a funeral wreath at his locker as a threat. And he realized if they could bring that flowers in there and no one saw them, someone could easily bring in a gun. And he quit baseball forever. and his career was over. But with that was the seeds planted of the legal fight that would eventually bring free agency, multi-million contracts, and incredible revenues for the players and the owners. And the idea of being with a team forever against the players' wishes became a thing of the past. But it took Curt Flood to say, no, I'm not going to do that. And every other player, none of the players at the time would support him because they were afraid for their own career. One of the people who did stand up for him, Jackie Robinson, who testified for him and basically said, yeah, you should be able to pick where you work. You and I take that for granted. Sports players take that for granted. They make millions of dollars now. But now they can all bring that back to the fight that Curt Flood gave back on starting on this day in 1970 when he said, no, I'm not going to the Phillies. I'm going to stay with the Cardinals or pick my own team. So on a day where we talk about rights and we talk about people fighting for their rights, it may not seem like as important a right as several other civil rights that were fought for, but that is the right to work where you want to and play where you want to and earn your money where you want to. And Curt Flood is a man who, in my humble opinion, was worth celebrating.
Yeah, and Kurt, he challenged the reserve clause about a year after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So you have to just assume that some of that played into this inspiration for Curt Flood to challenge the system and eventually break the system that was Major League Baseball at the time. And enacted this whole free agency revolution that we now see where players can choose to sign wherever they want. And it's crazy to think that back then you weren't able to do that. You had to, it was basically like in the NFL, they have the franchise tag where a player can't leave. If you give someone the franchise tag, they have to come back the next season. Baseball basically had every single season a franchise tag where you could give out to whatever player and they can never leave your franchise. So if it wasn't for Curt Flood changing the way that we have baseball now and pretty much all sports in general, because Curt Flood, Spencer Hayward at the time as well for basketball challenged the system, which brought about free agency as well. Like all these guys were connected around the same time during that time in the late 60s where you saw this big change in America at the time for the civil rights movement, of course. So Curt Flood was one of the revolutionary guys for his sport. We see it with other players in other sports, the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's, the Spencer Haywards of the world. And Curt Flood was one of those revolutionary sports icons that went above sports, and what he was able to do in the sport of baseball, trickled out into actual civilization or society, I should say, not civilization, it's society. So Curt Flood was just an amazing way he was able to do for the sport and beyond.
You saw the wave of African-American baseball players come in the 40s and the 50s, and uh, there became a new generation of players who were a little more, for lack of, I don't want to say assertive because Jackie Robinson certainly was a fighter, but you saw, as you mentioned, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Jim Brown. You saw, the rise of Muhammad Ali, and not, in his fight against Vietnam. You saw Tommy Smith and John Carlos in their protest in the Mexico City Olympics. You saw Curt Flood standing up for, for workers, his own workers' rights. And people have said sometimes if you bring up anything that is quasi-political, that we should stick to sports. Here's the deal. Sports doesn't exist in a vacuum. Sports in our society are always intertwined. And many, many times, progress and understanding can be done through sports, whether it was going back to whether it's going back to Joe Louis or Jesse Owens or to Jackie Robinson or through the 60s or through today. So many times, levels of understanding and levels of progress and levels of strife and levels of conflict can be found reaching a common ground on the sports field and understanding and coming to some form of understanding through sports. So if anyone thinks that we should talk about this and we should just stick to sports, let me just tell you, we are, because this is part of what makes sports work. Part of what makes it work is it unifies certain regions and people, but it also can help us find understanding and find common ground and hopefully, advance as a person and as people. And it is an absolute surefire bet that the entire civil rights movement was kickstarted by the desegregation of baseball. I don't think that's a strong statement to make at all. And if you're going to make any bets, go to Bet Online. Oh boy, it's
What a
your number one
segue.
source. It's your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. We got pro football playoffs going on. Will people in Buffalo finally be happy? They've got it all at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you ever listen to us, I bet you do. You can find those at BetOnline as well. They're having the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline is where the game starts. Oh, man, I didn't mean to get on my soapbox there, but what are you going to do? Hey, I want to just share something here. It is still Dr. King Day. A bunch of years ago, I wrote on my old Sully baseball blog. I actually have it up here. You can't see what I'm looking at here, but I did a thing called a dream team in honor of Dr. King.
Oh,
And I started thinking of before the desegregation of baseball, you had the Negro Leagues and you had Major League Baseball. And I think it's safe to say, and probably a surefire bet, that some of the players who were not allowed in the game would have been Hall of Fame level players. We don't know. We don't know who would have been the star, who would have been the best players, who would have an obscure player may have become a star. But the level of play of the segregated baseball was obviously lower because you weren't allowing all the best players to play. So I
hmm
wrote a list of, who, in terms of historians, there's no way we could really, it's one of the great tragedies of baseball is beyond just the social justice that some of these players could have changed baseball history. Who knows? The Philadelphia Phillies may have had a dynasty if they had Buck Leonard and Josh Gibson on their team. Satchel Paige could have been associated with one team, or, Oscar Charleston, who the great Buck O'Neill described as one of the greatest talents he ever saw. And this was a guy who discovered Hall of Famer after Hall of Famer. What if he was associated with one team instead of just the nomadic life of the Negro Leagues? And so some of these names, Josh Gibson, some of these names you've heard of if you're a baseball fan, like Josh Gibson, but like Buck Leonard, Willie the Devil Wells, Pop Lloyd, Judy Johnston, Turkey Stearns,
oh, what a name.
granddaughter whose granddaughter I've become very good friends with, the great Oscar Charleston, Cool Papa Bell, Bujum Wilson, who got that nickname because that's the sound the ball made when it hit the
Bajon.
wall. Bujum. Uh,
Okay,
Bullet Joe Rogan, Leon Day, Willie Foster, Ray Brown, Jose the Black Diamond Mendez,
damn,
Hilton
these names.
Smith, David Barnhill, Andy Cooper, Smokey Joe Williams, Cannonball Jackman, Ray Dandridge, who was buried in the Giants minor league system because the Giants had already met their quota of black players. Martin Domingo, Mule Studdles, Cristobal Torriente, Biz Mackey, and Double Duty Radcliffe because he caught and pitched. All these
Wow,
players would
original
be.
Otani.
Oh my God, yeah. And then you had Rube Foster, who was the greatest manager of the Negro Leagues and then later became the commissioner of the Negro Leagues. These are all people whose names should be associated with, the way that you still would hear Ty Cobb in Detroit, or Joe DiMaggio in New York, or Hank Greenberg with the Detroit, or, Babe Ruth with the Yankees, not the Red Sox. I mean, these are still names that you see on the walls and celebrated. And Christy Mathewson with the Giants. These should all be names that we're familiar with, but they're
Yeah,
not. And that, I
I
think,
also
is the great tragedy of the segregation.
I also think it's kind of funny, like doing the reverse exercise. Like, how many white American baseball players would we think are not as good if they had to play alongside other black baseball players? How many of those white American baseball players would be like, actually, they're not as good when we actually desegregate the sport and put them next to some black athletes? They're actually not as good at hitting the ball. They're actually not as fast as what we might have once thought when they were just racing against the Babe Ruths of the world. So I think that's also another fun exercise to look at the other side of the coin there.
Oh, it's the thing that it would be. You would see the both white and black players games would be raised if they were up against the better competition.
Yeah.
And by the way, notice we're also not bringing up any Dominican players from that time. There's a handful of Cuban players that came, but like basically the major leagues was who are the best players who live near a train station and happen to be white. That was Major League Baseball scouting department. If you had the best players playing alongside each other, yeah, the thrill of a competition would be there. I mean, we think about like some of the great catchers from there would be Bill Dickey or Mickey Cochran, but were any of them trying to throw out cool Papa Bell, trying to steal second base? You know, I mean, were did Joe DiMaggio or Jimmy Fox ever had to face uh, Satchel Paige on the mound? And likewise, did Carl Hubble have to face Josh Gibson or Turkey Stearns for that matter? I mean, you want to see the best competition. That's the whole idea of it. And one of my favorite quotes from a player from a famous white player who understood that this was a travesty what was happening was Dizzy Dean, star pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals, did some barnstorming thing with Satchel Paige, and they were the two greatest pitchers of the 1930s. And Dizzy Dean said to Satchel Paige, "If you and I were teammates, we would win the pennant by July and go fishing until the World Series got started." Because we would dominate, but we never got to see that.
Yeah, that's really tough to see. And also, I think we just missed out on a whole generation. It sounds like of just dope nicknames. Imagine if Turkey Stearns was a baller in Major League
Oh,
Baseball. Imagine how many turkeys would be walking around today. Dudes
oh
named
yeah,
Turkey and everything like that.
oh yeah. The nicknames are off the charts. They're the absolute best, and you just and apparently, I mean, you saw a glimpse of this when Jackie Robinson joined the Dodgers. The major leagues were pretty much station to station. I guess they were playing sabermetrics ball. They weren't stealing a lot of bases. And Jackie and brought in the style of play that they had, which was a lot of hit and run, a lot of going first to third, a lot of stolen bases. Probably was a very fast paced game. And I think you saw when you started to see, not just star black players, but also mid-level black player and reserve black players on Major League Baseball, you saw an increase in stolen bases in a fast game, certainly in the 60s and 70s, and peaking in the 80s with just tons of stolen bases. And, a lot of that stemmed from the fact there was a lot of artificial turf and a fast game was if you had fast players and the ball skipping through the infield, that would help. But you saw a level of play that was, very, very high at that point. And
Well,
yeah, sorry. Go.
Well, do you think that's correlated to today then? Because it sounds like, stolen bases went up in the 80s and whatever 70s when we had more of an influx of black talent. Now we see in today's game, the talent pool of black players is dramatic, dwindle down dramatically. And we also seen a downcrease in stolen bases as well in baseball over the last few years. So do you think that's then correlated? The lack of black players also correlates to the lack of stolen bases. I don't know why I keep saying baseball. Stolen bases we see in today's game.
I think we're going to talk about that in our next segment.
Okay.
Um, Millard brought up something I want to talk about because there is a tremendous decrease in the number of African American players. We saw Andrew McCutchen, who was one of the more recent black superstars, is returning home to his roots with the Pittsburgh Pirates. I'm glad to see that. Andrew McCutcheon is a player who is impossible not to root for, not just because his peak, he was a super exciting player and helped spark that brief renaissance we saw in Pittsburgh. But he just seems, everywhere he's gone, he seems to be like a good solid teammate and a good citizen and everything like that. And as he's winding out his career, heading back to where he was, but there has not been a great uh, replenishment of black stars in baseball. Obviously, there's a tremendous Latin presence, and we're seeing the signing of international players are coming from all different countries, including the Pirates just signed a couple prospects from Uganda, for God's sakes. We're tapping into Africa and other markets in Asia and in Australia and all throughout Central and South America and in the Caribbean. But there was a point where baseball was the top sport for African Americans in the United States. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's not now.
No.
It's really not. Um, I think there are some factors to that. And again, it's always interesting when a guy who has my background, looks like me, dips his toe into this one, but you're here to give me cover.
Yeah.
Uh,
Here to back you up in case anyone says
in ca-
anything silly.
and also if I say anything out of line here, I think one big thing is I think there's been a lot of sort of it's become a very expensive
Mhm.
to be a baseball player. Um, you have a lot of these winter leagues and summer leagues, and like it isn't like you played football. A lot of times with these athletes, it's not like you're playing football in the fall, basketball in the winter, and then baseball in the spring. You're playing one sport
Yeah.
all year long. Um, it's and some of those leagues and the equipment and everything are becoming more and more expensive, and not focusing on certain, you know I'm trying to not step on a rake here. It's been focusing on more affluent. uh it's become almost like tennis and golf in a way.
Yeah. No,
And
that's fair. No,
uh,
accessibility is definitely a huge part of it because you just think about how easy it is to pick up a basketball, pick up a football. I mean, you could pick up a baseball and play catch, but like anyone could just practice their basketball skills on a hoop.
mhm.
Anyone could pick up a basketball, go practice that. Anyone could just start having a little flag football game in the front yard to, play and practice football. But for baseball, you need a group of friends. You have to go find a diamond, which is also the tough part. You actually have to find a baseball field that'll let you go on there with your 8 buddies or 12 buddies, whatever you have. You need a squad of friends to go play a baseball game, and that's just a lot tougher to do in general, no matter your background. So I think just from an accessibility standpoint, it's a lot harder for someone to go find a baseball, go find a glove, and go play that sport as opposed to basketball or football. And I also think when you look at in terms of accessibility, when I think about like the NBA, when I think about football nowadays, you got like the AAU, you got all these basketball hoop circuits. These guys play together from kids. They travel around the country. They're stars before they even make it
Yeah.
to the NBA. You look at football, all these 3-on-3 leagues, all these 5-on-5 leagues. There's so many different groups and skills and camps that these other sports run that all these young kids gravitate toward. Baseball, I'm sure, has camps too. Right now, MLB this past weekend for the MLK weekend, they're doing their MLB Dream Series. So right now in Arizona,
Right.
they have all these camps where they're focusing on predominantly showcasing young African American players. But like that's a 1 weekend camp. I don't see too many Mookie Betts, baseball classic camps or this and that. Like if you look at basketball, it feels like every NBA star has their own version of their own basketball camp that they run. I feel like baseball doesn't really have that. I haven't really heard of the Mike Trout baseball camp, and maybe there is, maybe there isn't one. But I feel like when you think about accessibility, there's so many basketball camps around the country. There's so many football camps around the country. I think it's just a lot harder to get a group of baseball friends to come together and go try to practice and play that sport and get better at it, as opposed to some of the other sports you see that are popular in America.
Yeah, I also think the weather has something to do with it. I mean,
Hmm.
basketball can be played indoors.
Yeah,
I mean that's why. I mean, football is a little different, obviously, but I mean it's sort of
they
known
play
for
in
being.
anything though.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's you do see a lot of players coming out of the Caribbean, obviously, where there's the weather is great. And out of Central and South America where the weather is great, and you're also seeing there are academies and there are groups of people where they get groups of people together to play baseball there. I mean, I guess it's one reason why you get more hockey players out of Manitoba and you get more shortstops out of the Dominican Republic. Part of that has to do with the freaking weather. There's not a lot
Yeah,
of you're a big part of the Arizona Coyotes situation there. Not a lot of dudes there from Panama, playing
yeah.
hockey these days. That's
Hockey in
why.
the desert's tough in general. We're trying to really build that sport up.
But you do see a lot of players coming out of the Southwest and the South of America, and South America for that matter. But I think there's one other aspect, and this is I've been I've had a theory about this for a little bit, and I think that there was a period of time where there were a lot of the predominant stars in baseball were African American players. You're not just going through. We just mentioned the '40s and the arrival of Jackie, the arrival of the Henry Aarons and the Willie Mays and the Frank Robinsons and the Ernie Bankses, and then through the '60s, the Bob Gibsons and the, Roberto Clemente is still a god amongst the Puerto Ricans. But I mean, in terms of like, we mentioned, I said Bob Gibson, Lou Brock, Reggie Jackson, right, Dick Allen, all the way through the '70s. And then the '80s, you saw another great influx of superstars, the Kirby Pucketts, the Ricky Hendersons, the Tony Gwynns, the Dave Stewarts, the Dave Winfields, the Ozzie Smiths. And in the early '90s, you saw the next great wave of African American stars: Ken Griffey Jr., Barry Bonds. I mean, Barry Larkin, all these great future Hall of Famers or should be Hall of Famers were starting to come through and starting to become gigantic stars. And at that time, Major League Baseball was not promoting their own stars. And because there was such labor strife and they didn't want to put the stars on this giant pedestal, they were on the verge of this labor disaster of the early 1990s. At the exact same time, the NBA was exploding. Remember, the NBA's popularity was so low at the beginning of the 1980s that the NBA Finals was on tape delay.
Yeah.
And by the end of the decade, it was the biggest global phenomenon. Bird and Magic, obviously, and the end of Dr. J, obviously Michael Jordan caused that to explode to a level we never thought of. While Michael Jordan was exploding, Ricky Henderson was the greatest offensive force we've seen in years. Barry Bonds was the greatest talent we saw. Ken Griffey Jr. was the most exciting player we saw. Blah blah blah. Every Joe Carter, touch them all, Joe. You'll never hit another big one in life. Dave Stewart winning every big game in the world. Barry Larkin leading the Reds. All the stuff. Kirby Puckett, Tony Gwynn, and baseball was not promoting them. Baseball was not putting them front and center. They weren't doing the Nike ads. You knew the third or fourth player on the Bulls and the Suns and the Knicks. But most people wouldn't know who Ken Griffey Jr. is unless he was wearing his uniform and had a sign that said, "Hello, my name is Ken Griffey Jr." And that's inexcusable because he was not only supreme talent, did great on television, but wanted to be seen by everybody. And I think that I don't know, this may not be a huge factor, but I think the fact that there was a whole generation of kids not putting their posters on the wall, but putting, Barkley and Pippen and of course MJ on their wall. And then same thing with the NFL. I think that played no small part in an entire generation not idolizing a group of players and wanting to emulate them.
No, I think fame definitely plays a part of it because, like you're talking about, when you become a superstar black athlete in baseball, you don't get the same acclaim as you do in basketball or football. You can't just walk around the streets and get mobbed by fans like you do in the NBA and NFL. I think that fame does play a factor too. I feel like in the culture that we have here in America for a lot of these young athletes and youths, like just in general, like you want to be recognized for your talent. Like all these, we talked about all these basketball prospects coming up, they all have their mixtapes, all have huge followings on social media before they even blow up. But for a young baseball prospect, it's just not going to be the same fame and acclaim. We don't usually know how good a baseball prospect is, a youngster is, until they make it to the major leagues, until they start showcasing their ability. We know about these young NBA players and NFL players from their times in colleges and their times in high school. And you don't get the same level of fame if you're doing it the baseball method. And now you're looking at the sports of today. First off, like you just talked about, you don't have the fame. You also don't have that representation like you used to have back in the day in the 80s and the 90s. So it's harder for a young black American now to want to start picking up the sport of baseball because you look at the sport of baseball, there's not a lot of people you can identify with. You got the Mookie Betts of the world, you got still the Andrew McCutcheons of the world, but there's a small talent, a small pool of talent of black players right now in Major League Baseball. So I feel like if you really want to get young African Americans back to watching the sport of baseball, like I don't even know if there's really a way to do it, but I feel like you need like a black Shohei Ohtani realistically. Like you need a Tiger Woods of baseball because Tiger Woods didn't like make more black golfers, but at least got like the black audience to watch golf. And he at least got a different set of eyeballs and audience to watch the sport of golf. For baseball, I'm not sure you're going to have an influx of black talent if you get a black Shohei Ohtani, but you can at least get a new audience, more eyeballs to the game, I think.
I do think that the fact that they had such a large number of Hall of Fame or certainly all-star quality players who were African American at the beginning of the 1990s who were not given the press and not given the attention that they should have, I think plays no small part in it was like a generation of kids that was lost. And you saw, I mean, you'll see hero worship when, Ortiz returned back to the Dominican Republic, or, Miguel Cabrera coming back to, Venezuela, Mariano Rivera going back to Panama, all this sort of, you can still see there could be potential hero worship. I don't know. I don't have
Yeah,
the answer. I just want to address the question there because
yeah,
it seems, it seems strange. And I'll tell you something that I mean, if I were, I mean, I'm not going to negative smear campaign something here, but if I were, I know there was the whole RBI, reviving baseball in inner city program that the late John Young formed in the 2000s to sort of create some of these leagues. Maybe that will, some players will come from that. I would, if I, I mean, this is a mild smear campaign against another sport. What we're learning about concussions in football and the long-term destruction that can do to someone's brain, I would start saying, hey, instead of putting the helmet on and maybe turning your brains into mush, uh, yeah, there are helmets in baseball. You'll be hit by a pitch or two, but you don't get a concussion every time you draw a ball four. I mean, there should be just the safety for a kid uh, to play baseball. And let's face it, baseball is the best sport to play if you're a kid, because if you're playing youth basketball, you could pass it to the same kid every time. Youth soccer, you kick it to the same kid every time. Little league, every kid gets a turn at bat. Every kid gets a chance. And you know what? That's something to celebrate too.
yeah. There's some great positives to baseball. You get more long-term investment usually if you're a great baseball player. You get more long terms on your deal. The money you make way more as a baseball athlete than you do as an NFL player. But once again, like we were talking about, I think it goes back to baseball just not being like a cool sport. Like it's tough to say, but like I think young Black Americans just don't resonate with the sport of baseball as they do with other sports. You can't, like, young athletes today care so much about building their brand. And like you talked about, baseball still hasn't really figured out how to prop up the brand of their own athletes. So it's like if I'm a young athlete, why would I go to baseball? I can have the money in baseball, I can have the long-term security, but can I have the fam? Can I have the fame? Can I have the post-career after when I'm done playing the sport? Like I can in basketball and football, because a lot of those guys still have endorsement deals. A lot of those guys still have TV gigs and stuff like that. In baseball, you're just not in the limelight as much when you're done playing baseball, unless you're like Kevin Millar.
And here is where it's so frustrating for me on that issue. That for me, baseball seems to be like the single best sport for the internet age. In that there's always new content. Like right now, it's the NFL playoffs. Okay, I've made no bones about it. I don't follow the NFL, but I do. I'll watch a playoff game if it's on. I mean, I dip my toe into it, and I did watch the thrilling end to the Buffalo and Miami. Who's going to win? It's going back and forth.
Uh,
It's like, and I've a lot of friends from the Buffalo area, and some still live in Buffalo, and I'd like fans in Buffalo to experience joy in life. And I know that's sacrilege to say, but but then okay, the game is over, and now we got to wait a full week. If you love your football, you got to wait a full week for a new game. In baseball, there's always a game on. There's always a chance to show a highlight. There's always new content that you could be putting on there. The NBA seems to understand that. The NBA understands that if they put their content on, there's lots of games a week, and they're putting things on wherever the eyeballs of the fans are. Baseball always seems to fight the internet, blacking out games here, blacking out content here, restricting use of this or that. When the people who are trying to post these things are trying to carry the water for baseball, to say we're trying to put it in front of some of these young eyes. And I think it's frustrating for me because the way it isn't, because I'm going to watch baseball no matter what. But I would like to see the sport grow. I would like to find a new generation of fans to discover the game. I do think it's a thrilling sport, obviously, and they need to figure out, how do we get it in front of the right eyeballs, and how do we find the right, maybe the right star to, to make baseball cool again.
Yeah, and the issue is it feels like there's just so much hidden code in baseball where they have all these unwritten rules where every time you have like a Tim Anderson expressing himself on a baseball field, it always like feels like his voice is being quieted a little bit and
Yeah.
calmed down. So it's like it's hard to say you want more representation in baseball when every time one of these guys try to express themselves by being quote unquote showboating, pimping a home run, doing something like that, doing a bat flip after a home run, you always say, you know what, now we got to beam you next time up, or we're going to call you out in the press conference saying you're not playing the right way. Like Fernando Tatis Jr., when he hits a grand slam on a 3-0 pitch, we got to go rip him as the manager in the press conference. I think he was like ripped by
No,
his
no,
own manager or whatever.
that,
Like, what,
that was
what are we doing here?
that is the single stupidest thing. Like, if if someone wants to do cartwheels and have a marching band follow them around after a home run, I'm fine with it. In fact, it's funny that you hear about going, one of the places, one of my baseball bucket lists is to go to the Caribbean series, because I hear, like, when you go to the Caribbean series in the winter, and winter ball, it is a carnival, and you also hear that there's so much styling going on in those games. The home runs, and people are pimping their home runs, or strutting around on the mound when they get a strikeout. Let's do that. And all this nonsense about play the right way. Shut up. Shut up.
Shut up.
Babe Ruth used to tip his cap as he was running around the base path. Carl Yastrzemski used to watch and show up the pitcher when he was at home plate. Okay. People used to do all sorts of stuff. Those old timers you revered were looked down upon by the previous generation that they weren't playing it the right way. Shut your traps. Baseball is fun. So let's make it fun. Stop being fun police. Okay. Oh, dude. And also, what is it people love to see too? You show the clips of Carlton Fisk waving the ball fair, Joe Carter jumping up and down, Ken Griffey Jr. They don't just show Ken Griffey Jr. making the catch and then calmly walking back to the dugout, him holding it up as he's running and doing the little thing like that. We love to see that. So let's stop making it. Oh no, you must always show no emotion on the field. Stop it. Just stop it. If that's holding us back, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Stupidest.
Yeah.
Act like you've been there before, as if you wouldn't be jumping up and down like an idiot.
Yeah, I don't know why people want their players to be statues, like when they do something cool. Like I never understood that, but yeah, fans go wild in the stands. But you want your players to have no emotion when they're actually the ones putting in the work. I never understood that.
Well, here's the deal. Some people may just be a Bernie Williams and put their head down and do that, you know? Or some people may celebrate. Dennis Eckersley may do the whole thing where he points at you when he strikes you out. Or someone may be, you may be a Rivera and just sort of walk off the mound. It depends. It just depends. Let's bring out people's personalities, because in the end, remember when you and I talked about this. We're going to wrap this show up because we're in our fifth hour. But when I think I told you this, that someone asked me if you were going to try to get somebody who's not into baseball, what would you do? And I would say, watch what the Olympics do, which is tell their backstory. Get people interested in the story behind the person, and then they'll root for them. You root for them if you're doing British baking. You root for them if you're making a dress in Project Runway. You root for them if they're doing curling. Okay, you get emotionally attached to it, and so let's get emotionally attached to some of these players, and let's make some of these players represent certain parts of our country and culture. And damn it, here on Dr. King Day, we do unite everybody and say, stick to sports. Let's get all the best players playing in here. I want every best talented baseball player, whether they're being brought in from Uganda or Puerto Rico or Australia or Compton, to be playing in Major League Baseball so we can see the best product possible. Millard Thomas finishes off.
Yes, I agree with Sully. Think about how many great players that are not in baseball that are playing in the NFL or NBA right now just because they didn't want to come over to the sport. Imagine if Deion Sanders never wanted to give baseball a try. Imagine how many Deion Sanders there are playing other sports when they could be playing baseball. We got to get our representation back up. We need more black players in baseball. Let the kids play. Let them show their emotions. And Tim Anderson, hopefully you can be the one to lead us because he's one of the most fun players to watch. He just needs to be healthy.
Amen. All right, Millard. Well, hey, everyone, thanks so much for making Locked On MLB your first listen. And for your second listen, make that Locked On Diamondbacks. Your third listen, make that be Locked On MLB Prospects. Friend of the podcast, Lindsey Crosby. He's a prospect encyclopedia, and he's going deep on the MLB stars of tomorrow. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Speaking of getting your podcast, Millard Thomas, where can people listen to you?
Hey, you can follow me on Twitter at CreatorThomas24 for my personal account, or look up Locked On Diamondbacks, both Twitter, Instagram for the podcast. And please hit subscribe on the Locked On Diamondbacks YouTube channel.
And you can follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and on Instagram. You can follow me on Instagram at Sully Baseball Podcast and subscribe to us on YouTube. We have, I think I misread this, 4 billion subscribers.
Ooh.
Oh, wait, no, we don't. We have a little less than that, but that's our goal. Our goal is 4 billion subscribers. Then we'll put a tip jar in and actually just drop $1 in every month. And yeah, and Millard, if they all do that, I'll kick $100 over to you.
Oh wow!
So,
thank you so much. You're so generous. So
I'm
kind.
a generous man. Sticking to baseball with Millard Thomas of Locked On Diamondbacks. This has been the Dr. King edition of Locked On MLB. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. Let's fist pump for the doctor.